right, good morning. On behalf of Director Walters and Deputy Fallon and the FLETC and partner organizations African American History Planning Committee, it's my honor to welcome you to this morning's event, Reflections of a Vietnam Veteran, First Sergeant Retired McArthur Hill. Mr. Hill was born March 21st, 1943, in the great city of Woodbine, Georgia. He spent his childhood between Camden County and Harlem, New York. Mr. Hill graduated from Ralph J. Bunch High, a segregated school in Woodbine. He was a standout A student and superior athlete, having played starting fullback and serving as team captain for the first Camden County State Championship high school team, the Ralph J. Bunch High Hornets. Upon graduating from high school in 1961, Mr. Hill joined the United States Army during the time of the Civil Rights Movement and Vietnam War.
I want to welcome you again. And we're going to go down a little bit of memory lane this morning. And we're going to be in actually, I think, the presence of greatness this morning. And as he goes over his reflections of a Vietnam veteran. Sir, what an honor and a privilege it is to be on the same stage with you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I'm excited to get this started. So what we've compiled some questions to kind of prompt those reflections. So as I go through, I'll be asking some questions and not really sure of some of the answers. So this should be actually fun. So I'm going to jump right in. Okay, we've already established that you were born in Woodbine, Georgia.
Woodbine, Georgia.
At what age did you realize that serving in the military would be the way that you wanted to go?
Well, I never really thought of the military when I was growing up. It was after I graduated from high school and got in the workforce. And I started working at Gilman's United Paper Mill in St. Mary's. And after about a month there, I decided it had to be something better. So one evening we got off a little early, and the Selective Service office was still open. And me and a friend of mine decided that we were going to volunteer for the draft. So we went in, I sat down first, I filled out all the paperwork, got up, and he decided he didn't want to go. So here I am by myself. So about a month passed, and I came home one day, and my grandmother told me, said, "Boy, you got a letter up there on that table." I said, "Letter?" I'd never gotten a letter through the mail in my life. Oh. So I went up and I got the letter and I opened it, and it says, "Your friends and neighbors have selected you." I said, "Oh Lord, here we go." So I'm thinking now that my friend changed his mind, I was going to be by myself. So when I got to the bus station in Kingsland, 3 of my classmates and another guy that was on the football team with me, they were standing up there. And I said, "Well, where y'all going?" "We got drafted." So here we go. I got company. So we go to Jacksonville, Liberty Street. They take the physical and all, do all the necessary things, send us back home. The 8th of January, 1962, we went back to Jacksonville, got on a boat, and the journey started.
Wow.
We back then they didn't have 95, so we actually came right back through Woodbine. And I'm looking out the window trying to see somebody. Nobody to be seen. So we got to Fort Jackson, South Carolina that night, and got signed in and shown around the way we needed to be, the barracks, and get sheets and pillowcases and all that stuff. And we stayed there about a week, and they opened up Fort Gordon in Augusta, Georgia. And they sent us from there to Augusta, and that's where our basic training started. in Augusta, Georgia.
In Augusta, that's where you was at boot camp at Augusta?
Boot camp in Augusta, Georgia.
Okay. Now, when you first enlisted or volunteered, we were on the brink of the nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Was that a factor in you wanting to go down and sign up?
No, that had nothing to do with it. Nothing at all. In fact, when the Cuban crisis started, it was in October of '62, and I had already been in the Army about 9-10 months when it started. But we were a part of it. We road marched from Fort McCullum, Alabama to Tyndall Air Force Base in Panama City, Florida. And that was going to be our jump off to go into Cuba. And I remember it dearly because it's the coldest I'd ever been in my life. We road marched with no side curtains, no tops, and the windshields down in October. And back then it was really cold. We made our first stop at Fort Benning, and they fed us there, let us sleep overnight. Then we headed on back out to Tyndall. And we got there and we built a tent city right on the airstrip. And of course, when the Army took over the Air Force base, the Air Force used to can go in and eat any time of day. The Army took over 3 times a day. Brought all their ways with us.
Wow.
But anyhow, I remember that was the first time I really got scared because I thought we was going to war. We'd already got all the signals, all the live ammunition and everything. And then one day they said we were going back to Alabama. What happened? Kennedy said, search them or sink them. And they let him search them. And they didn't find no missiles going into Cuba. Now the Cuban crisis was about Russia giving Cuba missiles to aim at the United States. And those missiles could go all the way up to Washington. And they were nuclear. So it was a tough time at that time. And if you look at HBO, they got a documentary on there about the Cuban crisis and about what the president went through and his staff during that time with all the advice and everything. But the good news was that Khrushchev was the first one that bowed. And we got out of that one. Yeah. And I was able to go home for Christmas. And that was a blessing.
Okay, so in boot camp, you had some of your buddies with you. I know you've got one. Give me your best boot camp story.
My best boot camp story, I'm gonna tell you what I think it is. When we first got to the Army, they were teaching us how to make up your bed. And you had to put the little military creases and all that in it, and the hospital creases. And they had the wool blanket with the U.S. in the center of it, and they gave you two blankets. The other one was a dust cover that you put over your pillow, and everything. The 2 U.S.'s had to line up, and you had to make that blanket so tight that you were supposing they could flip a quarter and it would bounce. Well, the only problem was I didn't know how to do that hospital crease. I tried and it would never come together. So one of my buddies came over there and he made my bed up for me. Now, quite naturally, I had enough sense to know you had to make up that bed in the morning. So I slept on the floor. Oh, yep. I slept on the floor because I wasn't taking no chances.
Smart man. Okay, back in Fort McCullough, there was some turbulent times when you were there. What was it like during those times, and what role did the military play?
Well, I think the only thing I can really tell you about the difference in that was being born in southeast Georgia in 43, when we were still Jim Crow laws, and we thought we had it so bad here. This was the little leagues. Man, when you got to Alabama, you was in the major leagues. It was tough. Right before I got to Alabama, to Fort McCollum, the Ku Klux Klan had thrown a firebomb on a Freedom Riders bus coming through Anderson, Alabama, and burned it. And as the people got off the bus, they were bludgeoned, beaten during to death. And then we looked around the community, and right out of Anderson, they had the city of Oxford and the city of Hobson City. Oxford was an all-white city. The mayor, the police force, everybody there was white. Hobson City was an all-black city. The mayor, the police force, everybody there was black, and there was no interaction between the two. Each of them had their own municipality. They went their own different ways. And I had never seen nothing like that in Georgia. But they were protesting during that time. The Freedom Riders, the sit-ins, all the demonstrations was going on. Oh, Lord. I think back on it. Birmingham had a police commissioner named Bull Connors. And Bull Connors had a police force with attack dogs and water hoses. And when the people would march and protest, they would turn on these water hoses. And you could actually see people being washed down the street. The force was so high. And the attack dogs attacking them. But during that time, the military did nothing. Nothing at all. And as it kept going and kept going and kept going, and more protests, the more outrageous it got. Until one Sunday morning, on the news we heard in Birmingham, 4 little girls went to Sunday school, and the Klans blew up the church and killed them. And that's when things began to change. The Army brought in the 101st Airborne from Fort Campbell, Kentucky. George Wallace brought in the Dixie Division, the Alabama National Guard. We were on alert. And I think, I'm not sure if it was Pell City or Bessemer, was the standing point where we would all get ready to go into Birmingham. But when everybody got ready to get on the trucks, they had a formation, and they told all the blacks and all the Puerto Ricans to fall out. We couldn't go to the riots. And their explanation for this was because that was what was causing the riots then. Black and whites interacting, and they didn't want us swinging no gun butts at no white folks, what it was really all about. But anyhow, that's when the nation's eyes really opened to what was going on, I know, in Alabama, because it was some turbulent times in Alabama.
Wow. Okay, you mentioned this just briefly. This was the time that then Governor Wallace, and he blocked the entrance to the University of Alabama. How did that personally make you feel?
I felt pretty bad about it. No, not because he blocked the entrance, but because when the president federalized the Dixie Division for Wallace to step out the door, we had to send rations to him. Fort McCollum ration breakdown, we would ride all night to take him rations. And when we got there, we couldn't eat. We had to take these little boxes of C rations. We couldn't go in the dining facility and and eat, but we were the ones bringing the food. But when Wallace stood in the door at the University of Alabama, I personally think that he saved a lot of lives. I really think that because Wallace made the statement, segregation now, segregation forever. But in my personal opinion, I don't think Wallace was that bad. I think Wallace was a smart man. He knew by him standing in the door, going along with the crowd, that nobody would rush the kids trying to come in. Now, it was 2 African Americans were registered to go to the University of Alabama. It was, I know her first name was Vivian, and the guy's name was Hood. So they actually got into the school without getting hurt because of Wallace standing at the door. Okay. And then, of course, when they federalized the Dixie Division, the general from the Dixie Division told Wallace he had to move because he was no longer under Wallace's command. He was under the federal command.
Okay, tell me a little bit more about the Dixie Division. What exactly was that, and how did it impact?
The Dixie Division was the Alabama National Guard. The first time I met them was when they came to Fort McCullum to do their summer training. And they had the rebel flag over their heart, a rebel flag on the side of their helmet liners, and double D's for the Dixie Division. And every time they would come to Fort McCullum, it would be a big, big do, because they had a service club there, and quite naturally, the Army was integrated. So everybody went to the same place. When the Dixie Division came, it was always trouble. Now, one of the biggest problems there was, during that time, Fort McCullum was the training center for every female that came into the Army. They took their basic training at Fort McCullum, and they also took the AIT at Fort McCullum if there was going to be a clerical person. So there was all these females there. And at the service club, everybody intermingled with everybody, danced with everybody. The Dixie Division didn't like that. Not at all. So there was, and right down from the service club, there was a golf course, Anderson Golf Course. And the next morning, you might find people laid out in the golf course, on the golf course, bloody. And this was a hard time. Like I said, when I got to Alabama, I left the minor leagues. I went dead to the major leagues. And they were playing rough.
Wow. Well, after that, then I know you served some tours of duty in Korea and Germany. What were your duties at that time over in Germany?
When I got to Korea, I was a tank commander with the 1st Cavalry Division. And our job was to secure the northern border. And we used to train in case the North came across the border. But as a tank commander during that time, we had the M47 tanks, and they had searchlights mounted right above the guns. And when the infantry go out on patrol at night, we would have to go out on the Jim River and provide illuminations. If they saw anything or heard any noises that they couldn't identify, they would call the tanks to illuminate that area. And on one mission, we found a 2-man sub, North Korean sub, trying to cross over, and we was able to capture it. But my tour in Korea actually I played a lot of sports. And when I got there, they were asking for people to come out for the division football team. So I decided I'd give it a try. And I went out, and Lord, I didn't think I was going to make it. There were some guys there from Nebraska and Oklahoma that when they laid in the bunk, you couldn't see the bunk. I knew time was going to be hard. And then one day we were at practice, and the coach called me and another fellow over, and I thought he was calling us to cut us. And he told us we was going to be the captains. And I said, well, good God. A whole bunch I was paying off. But anyhow, we went to the 7th Corps one day to play a game. And after the game, my coach came up to me and said, Sergeant Hill, I got some bad news for you. I said, what's that? He said, your grandmother just died, and we got to get you home as soon as possible. And that was September 23rd, 1965. So they took me to Seoul, got on the plane, flew into San Francisco, into Jacksonville, into Woodbine. And I got there just in time for my son Marcus. He was being born in Brunswick. And I got home in time to bring him home from the hospital.
Wow.
So they always said, you lost one on the 23rd and got one back on the 24th.
Gained one.
And that was my biggest thing I remember about Korea. Now, Germany was a different story. When I first got to Germany, I thought, now this is nice, because it was a civilized community. Everything was just laid out just like here. One night, my platoon sergeant, his name was Cooksey, a white guy from Mississippi, he took me downtown to show me around. And of course, we end up at the guest house. The guest house over there is a bar. And we started drinking, and they had this thing called Jägermeister. And if you didn't know Jägermeister, you can sit at a fire and it'll give a flame. And Cooksey kept feeding them to me. He kept feeding them to me, and I kept looking at them and drinking some and pouring some on the floor. So when I had enough, I decided I'd walk back to the barracks, Hindenburg Concern. And on my way back, there was a couple of Germans coming towards me. And they looked up and saw me, and they crossed the street. And I was amazed. I sat there, and I just stood there, and I just thought, who do they think I am? I didn't have no training. I didn't have a mother or father. That was a hurtful feeling, to know that they were being just like the people in Alabama.
That you just left.
But no, there was a part of the community where the black soldiers went. No, it was just like being home. But when you leave that little section, it was right back to being in the South in America. But while I was in Germany, I experienced a lot of things, though, because we provided security from the East Germany and Czechoslovakia border. And we patrolled that border day in and day night, out every day of the week. It was some cavalry unit patrolling the border. And the funniest thing about the border is, if you're on the right side of the border, if you're an American and you're on the right side of the border, when you look to your left, you would see red and white barber poles, just like the barber poles you'd see in a barber shop. As long as you was on the right side of those barber poles, you was all right. But if you looked and you saw them on the other side, oh Lord, you were in trouble. Now, the East Germans and the Czech border, they had the same thing, the barber poles, but theirs was black and white. So if you looked to your right and you saw a black and white pole, you was in trouble, because you had done crossed the border, and that was an international incident. That was bad news. But sometime you go down on the border, and the East Germans on the other side, they're waving, and you know, it wasn't nothing but a little game of hide and seek. You'd go out on the border. When you go out right after dark and set up your little listening post, the LP. And it's supposed to be a secret. The people over on the other side of the border don't know where you're at. And you're listening for movements, for sounds of tanks or whatever. And before daylight, you would leave that position and come back. So they'll never know where you were at or nothing like that. But everybody knew all the stops along the border, you know. After you've been running them years and years and years, it wasn't no secret. But we were on the border one time, and we got a call to come in from the border, and I'm thinking, no, who died now? Somebody's got to be dead to call me off the border. And it come to find out, it was somebody had shot the president. I think it was not Kennedy, but Reagan. I know why that name's so hard for me to get out. Trickle-down economics. but anyhow, at the time, they didn't know whether it was a domestic shooting or was it a terrorist. Well, they didn't use the word terrorist back then. Everything was Russian.
Right.
Some of those forces. So we went into a major alert, and we stood down for war and moved all the vehicles up on the border and everything in case the Russians was trying to slip in. And then when they finally found out that it was a domestic shooting, some man was in love with a movie star. They pulled us all back in, and we went back to our normal operations of running the borders.
You probably didn't have a whole lot of free time, but what did you do to unwind and kind of enjoy yourself while over there?
Well, I can't tell you everything I did. My wife made sure that was the first thing this morning. But my first tour in Germany, I was fortunate. I had my son and my wife with me. So at that time, the Army had gotten to be just like a job. You got up in the morning, you went to work at 4 or 5 o'clock, you got off, and you went home. And the weekends, we would travel all over Germany. We would go to these medieval cities in Nuremberg, boat rides on the Blue Danube.
Wow.
We did all those kind of things back then, and it was really relaxing. And Germany was in itself a good place. There was all type of, you could actually go to a restaurant. The first time I ever heard of cordon bleu was in a German restaurant, and it was so delicious. In fact, if you go to a restaurant and you buy some type of meat like a schnitzel or a Wiener Schnitzel, and you took a bowl, they would fill it up with potato salad. If you took a wash pan, they would fill it up with potato salad.
So that's bigger.
They would fill it up with potato salad. Now, if you go to the slaughterhouse and you wanted pig feet and chitlins, the bigger bag you brought, the bigger bag you took home. Free. They gave it away. They didn't know the value of it.
I was going to say, they did not know.
But then, the Germans was a smart people. After a while, you go to the market, and there was pig feet in the showcase. They knew the value of it.
So they started getting smarter.
Oh, yeah. But Germany was real nice. And while I was in Germany, my second son was born, Roderick Hill. And he was born right at the end of my tour. So when we finally got him home and I got my orders to leave, I couldn't leave because he was too young to fly. So I had to extend and stay there until he was old enough to get on the plane. And then we came home with my orders to Vietnam.
Now, you were in the South Vietnamese Cavalry Unit, correct?
I was an advisor.
An advisor. What was that like? What were your duties? What did advisors do?
Well, advisors help plan the tactical movements, go with them on the field trips, on the patrols. We called in air strikes, artillery, different things like that.
That had to have been a culture shock. What did you think about the Vietnamese food?
Fish and rice. Wasn't nothing to think about. Fish and rice. And the bad part about it was when you sit down to the table with them, they put one fish in the middle of the table, a big bowl of rice. You get a cup. You fill that cup up with your rice. But everybody sitting at that table picks off of that one piece of chicken, that fish.
Wow.
But now they'll bring fish all day long, but they're not going to give each person their own fish.
Just one fish at a time.
But now the trick of that was we had chopsticks. And I didn't know how to use chopsticks when I first got there. So I was basically starving to death. Because now, you couldn't tell me that you were supposed to eat rice with 2 sticks. But as time went on, I don't think there was a Vietnamese over there could out-eat me. I learned all the secrets of the chopsticks, about pinching off of the fish. And then the good part was, as being an advisor, you traveled all over the country. And every time we got to some place that there was an American unit, I would go there, talk with the mess sergeant, and of course, they felt sorry for me. And they had these containers of, that they would put chicken, pork roast, pork ribs, all this stuff in it. And we would take it back, but now, the only problem with that was we had to hurry up and eat it because we didn't have any freezers
No refrigeration.
when we was out on maneuvers. But now back at the team house, we had a freezer. I'll tell you about the heat in Vietnam. We had the 2-gallon canteens, and you'd fill them up with water, put them in the freezer, let them freeze all night. Get them in the morning when you get ready to go out and get on the vehicle. It's hard as a rock. An hour later, it was hot water. It had thawed out, and it was hot. When we stepped off on the plane in Cam Ranh Bay, when we first got to Vietnam, when they opened the door, I never felt that type of heat in my life. But I think I had an advantage because I was raised up in South Georgia, and it was hot here too. But it was hot in Vietnam, and scary, because when we got off that plane, I didn't see nobody with a gun. All I saw was a bus, and I'm looking around thinking, there's supposed to be a war. Somebody's supposed to be here with a gun. But anyhow, it was an experience.
So then you left Vietnam went to Fort Knox, then you returned to Vietnam, and you were serving still as an advisor, right?
Yes.
But this was toward the end of the American involvement. Was it a different field then?
Yes. Now, when I'd only been home about maybe 6 months before I got my orders to go back. First, I thought it had to be a mistake. Then I thought, it's got to be a mistake. Because I knew guys there that had never left Fort Knox, and they were sending me back. So anyhow, we went to Oakland Army Terminal in Oakland, California, and every day they would post where you were going. And because they were shutting down Vietnam, everybody that thought they were going to Vietnam ended up going to Korea, going to some other duty station, and I'm waiting on my name to come up to see where I was going. And sure enough, one morning it was there, the Republic of South Vietnam, and I couldn't figure that out to save my life. But when I got to Vietnam this time, the American Army had given the Vietnamese the M46 tank, and I was there to train them on the use of how to use the tank, how to fight it, how to maneuver with it. And the funniest thing was, we were around the Saigon area, and that's where we received the 54 M46 tanks. And we put them on cargo barges, and we took them up the South China Sea to a place called FLETC. And we offloaded them about maybe 20 clicks out of FLETC, and we road marched from there into FLETC. Not a bullet to our name. No shells. We got the tanks, but we didn't get the ammo. So here we are on the road, all these tanks, no firepower. But it was such a show of force, and nobody knew we didn't have no shells, that we made a safe trip in the FLETC. And that's what I was there doing. My second tour was to train the Vietnamese on how to use the tank. Before then, when I was in Germany, in Fort Knox, I served with the United States Army Armor School as a teacher, teaching tank gunnery skills to foreign officers and American officers. We used to train at Fort Knox. We would train the Israeli army and a lot of the Egyptians, Iraq at the time, different cadets. And then when the war came between the Israelis and the Arabs, all the Israelis dropped out of school and went home. The Arabs stayed. Smart people, very smart.
And then I know after that you had a couple of stops back at Fort Knox, and then back at Germany, I think for the third time, and then you decided to retire. Knowing what you know then, would you do it all again?
I wouldn't change a thing. Now, I hear a lot of people talk about the military, and I guess at one time I was one of them. But now, when I got in the military, coming from South Georgia at the time, and Gilman Mill, I didn't know which was going to be worse, the Army or the Mill. After I stayed in the Army about 2 months, I went to the re-enlistment man, and I re-enlisted for a year, for one additional year. And what that would do, when you volunteered, you got drafted, your serial number started with US. US was a draft number. Okay. If you wanted to stay in the Army, you did the 3 years, and it'd be RA, regular Army. And I signed up for regular Army. my first 2 months in the Army. I knew it was better than Gilman Mill. No doubt
Anything
in
to
my
stay out of the
mind.
mill.
So I reenlisted right off the bat because I had no inkling of leaving. I enjoyed my military. I enjoyed the things that it did for me, the things that it taught me. I've got a chance to see places all over the world that I would only read about in a book. My first tour was in Korea. En route to Korea, I got to California. We stopped in Hawaii. We stopped over a couple of days in Guam, Okinawa. We spent 5 days in Yokohama, Japan. Nobody from Woodbine ever seen them places. And I wouldn't have seen them if it wasn't for the United States Army. Korea, oh yeah. In Germany, we get a chance to visit Austria. I don't think Marcus could remember that. But we went to the place where they made the Sound of Music. We saw all the Maximilian castles and all that. Wow. Where Napoleon was exiled. I mean, there was just so many different things to see. And Copenhagen, Denmark, back then, all the hot spots. You got a chance to see them all.
Well, I'm going to follow up with one final question, and then we're going to open it up. So if anybody in the audience has any questions, be thinking of those. Okay, your final question, sir. With the generations that are coming up around us, if you could give any advice to the young people today, what would it be?
Well, on a serious note, I think if a young person today don't have intent to go to college or find some kind of career path to follow, they should hurry up, knock the door down to their nearest recruiter. Go military, go Army first. Now, my biggest disappointment about the military was, as much fun as we had in the Army, my son joined the Air Force. Now, that was a kicker.
I wasn't going to go there, but since
Oh,
you
yeah.
did.
But let me tell you this story about him.
You're in trouble now.
When he got ready to graduate from college, we all went up to Valdosta for his graduation. But before they had the graduation, they had another graduation for the ROTC. And we were all standing out there. They got the little formation together, and there was a big oak tree there, and I was leaning up against the oak tree. And the colonel came out and called the cadets to attention, and he started making his speech. And he said, in every cycle, there's one cadet that distinguished himself more than all the rest, and he becomes the cadet of the cycle. And I heard that man said, this cycle was Lieutenant Marcus L. Hill. I stepped behind the oak tree and started to cry. I couldn't believe this boy had done that. And I was back there crying to myself, and after a while I felt a hand on my shoulder, and I looked around and it was Marcus. And he looked at me and he said, darn, Dad, what you thought I was doing? Just playing up here and drinking beer? So that was nice.
I knew he was going to tell on you. All right, are there any questions from the audience?
I just wanted to know if you ever learned to make that rack, or did you sleep on the floor the whole time in boot camp?
With my eyes closed, I can do it today.
First of all, sir, thank you for your service. I do appreciate it. I'm Steve Lubin. I'm a retired Army officer. Hooah. Okay, hooah. But, sir, could you, when you joined in '65, okay, 3 years later, Martin Luther King was assassinated. What effect did that have on the Army and the African Americans serving in the Army at that time? Thank you.
When Martin Luther King was killed, I was in Germany at the time, Ansbach, Germany. And I think that was a hard time, basically because just like they were doing in Detroit and all over America, they were doing the same thing in Germany. The blacks was rioting. It was just a hard time. And to know that Martin Luther had gotten assassinated and to hear the things that the people were saying about him, and they wasn't good things. The name calling, it was just a hard time, and we fought as best we could, but of course, you know, we were outnumbered. But that was really a hard time. They brought in a black officer to our unit. I think he was a lieutenant colonel or a colonel to talk to us. And that made it worse because they thought they was trying to appease us by showing us that there was a black officer of stature in the Army. And we were young then. And just mad, really mad at what had happened with Martin Luther King. Such a dynamic man. As I followed Martin Luther King, not in his sittings and stuff, but when we were in high school, we used to read about the things that he was doing. But the one that we really thought about during that time was Thurgood Marshall. He was on the Supreme Court, but before he became a lawyer on the Supreme Court, a judge on the Supreme Court, he was a civil rights attorney. And he used to come to Brunswick quite regular. And he was the one that did the argument with the Supreme Court on Wade versus the Board of Education in '58. And 58, I think it was before then. But anyhow, he won that argument, and Equal But Separate was shot down, where we all were supposed to go to the same schools. That was in '54. But in Camden County, that happened. The integration started in Camden County in the early '70s. So from '54 to '70-something, we were still equal but separate. Although the law of the land said equal but separate was outlawed. But it didn't come to tuition until the mid-'70s.
Anyone else?
When you came back from Vietnam.
Why did you have to open that can of worms? Now that was a trip. You know, I guess everybody's dreams would be to go off to war and come back, and you see it in the movies all the time. The lady out there plowing the fields, she'd look up over the hill and she'd see the man coming down. She'd drop the plow and she'd run, and it's in slow motion. And they're running and running and running, and they just get that big embrace. It wasn't that way. When we got off the plane, we was everything from baby killers to warmongers. We had everything. The biggest weapon that they had was an old egg. They would throw eggs at you, rotten tomatoes. You know, since you asked, I was home one night and I saw on television where the troops was coming from Iraq. And when they got in the airport, people stepped aside and started to clap and cheer them as they walked out. We didn't see none of that. It was a different time. And it was just here lately that we became heroes. I don't know what happened, but now every time I go in the restaurant with this hat on, thank you for your service. But time had changed. But Vietnam was an unpopular war, and we was treated like we started the war, not like we was there fighting for the country. But it was a hard time coming back from Vietnam. But I will tell you one thing about that same thing. When I was in Vietnam, I got a call from the Air Force relay station, and they said they had some open lines that we could make phone calls home. So I made a call back home, and the operator said, "Tell Sergeant Hill his wife ain't home." And I looked at my watch and tabulated. It would have been about 3 o'clock in Woodbine. And she ain't home. But anyhow, the next thing I heard the operator said is, "Tell Sergeant Hill his wife is going to New York. His mother just died." And that's how I found out my mother was dead. Making a phone call home. And the next thing I know, the Red Cross called in and everything, and I was on a plane out from California again. Got there, the New York Knicks basketball team was on their way back to New York from playing the San Francisco Warriors. And I got on that flight with them. Jungle fatigues and all. And I've never been treated so good. The New York Knicks brought me back to New York. When we got there, they had a player called Cassie Russell out of the University of Michigan State. He took me to my mama's door and let me out. But I'd catch a taxi in uniform, and they would ask me where I was coming from. Told them I was coming home from Vietnam to bury my mother. I couldn't pay for the taxi. Go in a bar, I couldn't pay for the drinks. So that was a good time.
Last call. Any fun? We have
Here we are.
Sir, you mentioned the fish you had over in Vietnam. Did you use the sauce, the nuoc mau?
You know, I found a place the other day over here where they sell nuoc mau. In fact, a funeral director, Moses Myers, he brought me a bottle about a year ago. Yeah, speaking about nuoc mau, I was stationed in Phan Thiet, South Vietnam, and that was the nuoc mau capital of Vietnam. And nuoc mau was a fish oil that I guess if you've never been to Vietnam, if you ever been to Korea and ate kimchi, and it was the smell. It was really good tasting, but it had a smell that was out of sight. Yeah, I used a lot of nuoc mau.
All right, I have one question. Would you happen to know Dionne Warwick? All right, I'll move on.
Okay.
All right, so let's give our guest a hand. Before I close out, I'd like to invite Director Walters up to give a special presentation, along with my stepmother, Emma Hill, and my wife, Chrissy Hill.
Well, so we are honored by your presence today and appreciate your participation. We're all better for it. I'll just read this certificate of appreciation in recognition of your exemplary service to this nation and significant contribution to this year's Federal Law Enforcement Training Centers and Partner Organizations National African American History Month commemoration. Thank you for sharing your perspective and reflections related to this year's theme, African American Times of War. Your presentation immensely contributed to this overall success of this year's program. In testimony thereof, this honor is awarded under the seal of the United States Department of Homeland Security at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Centers on this 20th day of February 2018.
Hold up. Thank you. Okay.
In addition, we have this coin from the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center that we'd also like to present you with, as your memory of your visit here as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chrissy, where that wheelchair at, girl?
Okay, you can have a seat.
I'll tell y'all, I wonder where that man on that poster went. He could run all day.
All right, again, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out today to celebrate this event. If you're part of the FLETC Partner Organization Planning Committee, would you please stand? And also a special thanks to Mrs. Vicki O'Connor for agreeing to do the interview. And I gotta give a special shout out to the multimedia division. They just make it come together. So with that, this concludes today's ceremony.